Welcome to part 2 pertaining to the Mackyard incident of 2007 and fake qualifications at CN Rail. In this video, we're going to continue to look at issues that, even though they date back a little while, absolutely impact the Canadian and the US rail industry, given the players and so many issues that now devastate, quite frankly, both the Canadian and, in my opinion, the US rail industry, as no less than 5 Class 1 rail carriers may be impacted because players have gone from Canada's CN Rail to other Class 1 rail carriers in the US and brought with them their operational excellence. Now, just to recap, the Mackyard incident happened on September 17th of 2007. And even though that's, 18 years ago, those issues still to this day have not been properly addressed by Transport Canada. And what's worse is that Transport Canada allowed several of the key players to escape to US Class 1 rail carriers, and so all the operational excellence under these players has been taken with them to the US rail industry. Because in my opinion, leopards just don't change their spots. And given how we're seeing the US rail industry being so devastated in the last 6 years or so, I'm not surprised to see what we're seeing in the US rail industry. And if you want to know a little more about that, look at the video again by Brandon Petty entitled Railroad Workers Anthem. And listen especially to the first couple of minutes where that woman is narrating just how bad things have gotten in the US. Well, 6 years ago, when she talks about the 6 years in the last 6 years, that's about when Canada started to allow some of these rail executives that should have been prosecuted, in my opinion, in Canada to escape to the US rail industry. Now, if we look back at some of their history, or their skeletons, as I like to call them, they did definitely go back to the Mackyard incident and later, but the Mackyard incident, just to recap from the first video, involved a belt pack movement with a supposedly qualified conductor who had 1 month of experience, and quite frankly, he was fake qualified. There's no denying that man had been, or woman, they don't say if it's a he or a she, but they'd been fake qualified. And so there were dangerous goods cars containing chlorine gas that derailed. Luckily, those were not breached. But Toronto's Mackyard, that's, outside of a massive population center in Canada. And so when you have all these issues with fake qualifications, it can become a very serious issue when these people are dealing with dangerous goods, as was the case here. And so even though the chlorine gas did not have those rail car breached, so the chlorine gas was not released, what was released was several thousand liters of diesel fuel. So again, that involved a belt pack movement, and this happened way back in 2007, but it absolutely explains a lot of what's going on in today's rail industry in both Canada and the US. Now again, just a small recap from video 1 on the Mackyard incident. The blue arrow here shows percentage of the evaluations that showed needs improvement. And we had been given, I called that section of this report in the last video, Lying with Statistics by the Transportation Safety Board of Canada, because they tried to make us believe that that number in the blue box was 55% of evaluations showed that this qualified conductor needed improvement in matters pertaining to yard knowledge. But if you look at the actual numbers and you look at what was stated on the previous page, on page 12, they themselves had stated that when it came to yard knowledge, 12 of 15 assessments, or 80%, showed needs improvement. So you can't say 80% on one page and then try and make us believe only 55% on the next page. And so unless every block in the lower red and green, this chart that they provided on page 13, unless every block in a column is filled in and you have no white spaces there, you can't calculate the statistics the way that they did. You can't, say, okay, well, 12 of the 22 showed needs improvement. That's the 55% they give us. Wrong. The fact that you had all those missing evaluations, there were 10 of them that were blank. And so you can't say that they would have been okay. You can't lump them with the okays. It's not 55% that showed needs improvement. It was 12 of 15, which is 80%, as was correctly stated on page 12. And so that's how the data should have been calculated throughout this analysis. And the stuff that's provided on page 14 of 32 here, where I put all the X's at the top, those are all bad numbers. They're not calculated properly. The only numbers that are true here are the ones in the green boxes. Only 5 of the 14 categories were properly calculated. The rest you can consider lying with statistics by Transport Canada. So that's the point of this, just to recap. Okay, so this is where we're really going to pick up on the new stuff here. Even though the table's the same, some of the stuff that I'm going to be discussing lower is new stuff. So if you look at this table, weeks 3 and 4 were considered observation trips. That's when a conductor trainee just goes on the train or works in the yard. They don't handle the equipment. They're just there to observe. That's all they're doing is observing. And then there was supposed to be, if you look further down, week 10 through 14, those were supposed to be your trial trips where you're actually working in the yard or on the line and you're actually doing the work. There's a big difference between an observation trip and a field trip where you're actually doing the work yourself. Now, if you look at the paragraph, the first paragraph below this table says that they used to complete this schedule in this table in 5 to 6 months. But now, in 2007, they were completing it in 3 to 4 months. And so up to 2 months of training were being chopped off. As little as 3 months, that's only 14 weeks. And for somebody working in backyard, or anybody who's new to this industry, that, in my opinion, can have deadly consequences. But we're going to go through more of this. So it states here that if you look where the purple arrow is, the large purple arrow that's on the right there, it says that it became practice to include the observation trips of weeks 3 and 4 when calculating the minimum number of trips required before qualifying as a conductor. You were only supposed to be counting the 45 trips of actual work. You weren't supposed to be including weeks 3 and 4. Now, the other thing I want to point out here is on page 14, on the other side, the other half here, where it says qualifying test for conductor. You can see here that they're referring to 2400 West assignment, the helper on the 2400 West assignment. So this happened in Mac Yard. And so here you have them referring to a section of the yard, not as Mac Yard, but as 2200 West assignment. And we saw previously in the table that had the evaluations where there were numbers on the far right column, and it looked like those could be subsections of MAC yard was what I was thinking. They could be, yards in nearby cities that are still fairly large, but definitely those numbers could be subsections of MAC yard, as it seems 2200 West would have been. But anyways, it states again that this person qualified as a conductor on August 14th, 2007, after completing 34 training trips and a qualifying test. But we've just been told via the purple arrows that they were now including the observation trips as part of the ones being counted for whether or not somebody had completed their field trips. That should never have been happening. Including observation trips as qualifying trips could explain the missing appraisals that we saw in the previous table with the red and green blocks, where there were only 22 appraisals submitted. Well, if this person qualified after 34 trips, well, 34 minus, let's say, 12. Let's say in weeks 3 and 4, you worked for 6 days each of those weeks. That would be 12 trips. 34 minus 12 would equal 22 trips, which would be equal exactly to the number of appraisals that had been submitted. And that would also help explain why there were no appraisals and 12 of them were missing for the 34 supposed trips completed. Because if you're on an observation trip, you're not doing anything. There's nothing for the supervising conductor to evaluate. The conductor trainee is only looking. He's not doing anything, just observing. And so you can't appraise someone on just observing. And so that would absolutely explain the exact number of missing appraisals. And, if this was going on, which it definitely wouldn't, the Transportation Safety Board would not be putting that comment in there unless it was absolutely happening, because that comment is so incriminating. So if you look at the numbers, well, first of all, to include observation trips as field trips, either whether or not those would have been, yard or road, that's a huge violation of the Railway Safety Act, Section 20, which says that any changes to training programs for frontline rail workers must first be filed with the Minister of Transportation for prior review and approval prior to field implementation. And I can pretty well guarantee you that this had not happened, because I requested a copy of all training program changes through Freedom of Information, and nothing was ever provided to me by the Government of Canada. And so it would very much appear that all these program changes, in my humble opinion, all these deadly program changes that were happening at CN Rail over a period of almost 2 decades, were very likely, in my opinion, done illegally. With Transport Canada, when incidents would happen, as in the case of the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney, Transport Canada, who had not been doing their job as an oversight body, but rather was a rail partner in crime, was there to provide appropriate death cover-up reports and investigations, along with the Transportation Safety Board of Canada and the Occupational Health and Safety Tribunal of Canada. And we're going to get into that one later too. But anyways, so if you take the 34 trips minus the 12 trips, which would have been observation trips, again, that would equal the 22 trips, or exactly the number of trips with appraisals, meaning the qualified conductor may only have had 22 of the required 45 field trips to qualify. And 22 divided by 45 is only 49% of his required training. And if 60 trips were required to work in Mackyard, as I believe may be the case for Mackyard, the union contracts have special provisions for certain yards. And I believe Mackyard, which is one of CN Rail's largest yards, has that provision in it. I have to go back and find it when I do the union stuff. But if that is true and it required 60 trips to be qualified as a conductor for Mackyard, and I believe that would have been 30 in the yard and 30 on the road or on the line. Well, 22 of 60 would only have been 37% of the required training, maybe as little as what this person might have had working in this extremely large and dangerous yard where it could take 12 to 18 months to become familiar with the yard. So this is absolutely a person who was fake qualified. And I would add that there was criminal negligence on the part of CN Rail and Transport Canada for failing to do compliance audits to make sure that people were getting the required training. Again, this involved dangerous goods. And Transport Canada is not taking its oversight role seriously as the body regulating federal rail carriers, or all rail carriers in Canada. And I would also add, massive financial fraud on the part of CN Rail and the Government of Canada. Because when you're allowing investors to think that rule of law prevails when it doesn't, and you have all these violations of the law, and you've got all this dangerous stuff going on, you're leading investors to believe you're properly training your workforce when you're really not, and potentially giving them only 37% of their required training when they're working with dangerous goods. I think most rail investors would run from CN Rail if they knew of these issues. And I suspect the same would be true when it comes to Government of Canada securities, because the Government of Canada is in no way innocent in any of this, in my humble opinion. All right, if we look at what's on page 10 and 15 of the same railway investigation report pertaining to the Mackyard incident, on page 10 here, I noticed that it said after completing a minimum number of shifts, and then it states as set out in their contract. That's a very important point, because if the program that is on file with Transport Canada, let's say Table 1 was on file with Transport Canada, and that's what, everybody thinks, weeks 1 through 16, 17, whatever, and this is the layout of the course. But if the union contract stipulates 60 trips instead of 45, that's a legal obligation. And rail carriers don't just have the right to violate union contracts. If you can show that the union is allowing this to happen, wouldn't that be an issue if it's pertaining to matters of safety of frontline rail workers? How is it that the union is not tracking whether or not their members have the proper number of required field trips and tests as required before they can become qualified conductors? How is it that they're not picking up on the fact that observation trips are being included as qualifying trips? How is it in the case of the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney that the union would have us believe they did not realize Numerous laws were being violated when conductor trainee Jason Clooney was killed. SOR 87-150, Section 5, was absolutely being violated, and the union knew it. There was a union rep who was present when the witness statements were being taken by the Transport Canada Health and Safety Officer. And if that's the case, and the union knew, and knew without a doubt, that laws were being violated when conductor trainee Jason Clooney was killed? As Roland Hackle, who would be the only witness at the 2016 Occupational Health and Safety Tribunal of Canada Decision 20 hearing, he was the only witness who appeared for frontline rail workers in matters pertaining to the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney. That witness was not even on the scene that day. He was a VP for the union, the Teamsters Canada Rail Conference. And in my opinion, that entire Occupational Health and Safety Tribunal of Canada hearing and decision, which made the rail industry, in my opinion, even more dangerous as it set nasty precedents, that thing was prearranged, in my opinion, before a word was even spoken in that hearing. And we're going to get into that in further videos. But I have had more than one rail worker tell me the union does nothing for us. Really? Well, union leaders, all those union dues you collect tax-free could certainly become something those of us in finance know as taxable income if you are not acting in the interest of the union and its members. And being a party to death cover-ups or fake qualifications would absolutely not be acting in the interest of the union or its members. And breach of fiduciary duties, sweeping of issues under the carpet when it involves rail worker deaths, I think for that one, you could probably be found personally liable. Just my humble opinion, but I'm sure there's plenty a good lawyer out there who could get to these issues. So rail unions who don't act in the interest of their members, once frontline rail workers all start to know of these issues, if I were you, I'd be on the up and up and being very careful as to which side you choose to be on in these issues. In my opinion, there's a lot of people who belong in jail over issues like this and issues that surface due to the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney. But again, violation of union contracts. Why would the union not be speaking up? Why would it not be having systems in place, compliance audits to track whether or not union provisions were being violated, especially when there was indication that that was absolutely the case? So you'll note here it says since 2012, the Teamsters Canada Rail Conference, that's the union in Canada representing most rail workers, the union has been involved in making recent changes to the Conductor Intensified Field Training Program, or boot camp, and the trainer/trainee evaluation process. Really? Well, TCRC, as you well know, and painfully know, conductor trainee Jason Clooney was killed in 2013, when you were clearly part of the process. So, if you were to ask me, was the TCRC part of the death cover-up in matters pertaining to the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney? In my opinion, the answer is yes. Just my opinion. The rest of you are free to form your own as you go through the rest of the materials on my YouTube channels and on my websites. And the other thing that I would point out here is, well, before 1995, it took 2 years, the green arrows here show that, to become fully qualified as a conductor for CN Rail. That's because before 1995, CN and CP were both crown corporations of the government of Canada. As soon as they became publicly traded companies, oh, now we got to maximize shareholder wealth. Where are we going to cut expenses? Frontline worker training programs. That's where they cut. And that's where they made, in my opinion, deadly cuts. And, you know, even though they say that since 1995, the present day program can be completed in 17 to 20 weeks, well, wait a minute. Okay, now this report was written, this on the right is not the Mackyard report. This is taken from the Railway Investigation Report pertaining to the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney, and it's provided on page 10. But we just saw in the Mackyard incident report that this could take as little as 3 months or 12 weeks. So even this is a misrepresentation by the Transportation Safety Board. So it's not 17 to 20 weeks, it could be 12 weeks. As little as 12 weeks. And they've known that at the Transportation Safety Board and at Transport Canada since at least 2007. And there is no excuse for Transport Canada allowing training program changes that were not properly filed with Transport Canada for prior approval by the then sitting Minister of Transportation. And back in September of 2007, that would have been a man by the name of Lawrence Cannon, I believe. So if all of these program changes that are brought out in the Mackyard incident were not pre-approved by the Minister of Transportation, either him or one of his predecessors, CN Rail is in a lot of trouble, in my humble opinion. So, and also in the Mackyard incident, and this is true to this day, I believe, that belt pack training programs, to this day, there's no discussion on how the train length, tonnage, or topography can affect train braking distances. The training programs in place leave a lot to be desired, which may explain why there are so many belt pack or remote control locomotive operator incidents in the rail industry. So just some key points to be aware of when it comes to unions, training programs, timelines, etc. Okay, so on the left here, it says that, and this is again from the Mackyard incident, on page 13 is what's at the top and page 8 is at the bottom. But at the top it says Macmillan Yard knowledge was not tested during training and qualification for this fake qualified employee who was part of this dangerous goods incident in the Mackyard incident. And it says there were no maps included in training materials. There were no maps of the yard in the yard manual. And so people were basically making their own hand-drawn sketches. This was the operational excellence at CN Rail in a yard that had more than 200 tracks and which could take a year to 18 months for employees to become truly familiar with this yard. So again, is that really the operational excellence that rail investors would want under these rail executives at CN Rail? And the other issue, folks, is if you look here at This is the Canadian Rail Operating Rules, and that's the 2013 version I was given after the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney after he was killed. This was part of the materials that I obtained via a Freedom of Information request. And if you look at the bottom, you can see the page numbering there, as I've explained in my other videos. The very bottom page number, that was put on by the people who collated the 1,000 or so pages I was given through access to information when I requested all the information pertaining to the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney. And so under the Canadian Rail Operating Rules, the 2013 version, which was after the Mac Yard incident for sure, but under the general rule, point 10, or X in brackets there, it says that employees must be familiar with their duties and the territory where in which they operate. So kind of looks like they were supposed to be familiar with the area where they worked. That would be familiarization training, supposedly required under the Canadian Rail Operating Rules. So is this something CN can just throw out because it doesn't like that provision and it doesn't want to provide that because of a cost benefit analysis, because it costs them too much to provide this familiarization training? So we'll just throw that part of the Canadian Rail Operating Rules out? Well, as we saw in previous videos, one of my first series of videos had to do with, I put it under the We Are So Lied To video series or playlist under Rail Families United. But it gives you the difference between acts, regulations, rules, guidelines, whatever. And according to the Government of Canada, only acts and regulations are truly enforceable in court, not rules. And so if CN throws out this requirement for familiarization, does that mean it's perfectly fine to do so? That it's just a Canadian Rail Operating Rule, so we can throw it out? Well, then I guess all your rail employees could throw out all your other rules that are part of the Canadian Rail Operating Rules if they're truly not enforceable in court, according to the Government of Canada, right? What's good for the goose is good for the gander, as the saying goes. We'll just take those pieces and parts that we're comfortable with implementing or observing. And so if any Canadian Rail Operating Rule is not observed, because, well, we just don't want to do that one, why should any employee be fired? Well, they should always be able to get their job back because these rules aren't enforceable in court, according to the Government of Canada. Kind of a big issue, right? But anyways, it's also kind of a big issue to have frontline rail workers in yards like Mac Yard making their own hand-drawn sketches because CN wasn't providing them. For a yard with over 200 tracks, potentially hundreds of switches, and where it could take 12 months to 6 to 18 months to become familiar with the yard. So could this fall under criminal negligence again on the part of CN Rail, not providing yard maps to frontline rail workers when they're doing their jobs? People getting hurt, dangerous goods accidents. I think your average juror would probably think, in my opinion, if it was me on a jury, absolutely criminal negligence. That's what I'd be thinking. But that's just me. You're free to form your own opinion. The other issue that needs to be mentioned here is when we're thinking about the importance of familiarization and the fact that, okay, maybe it only exists in the Canadian Rail Operating Rules. I would wonder if it exists in Regulation 0-8, the Uniform Code of Operating Rules, because I believe that regulation may include familiarization. I have to go back and check. but that would be a regulation. But anyways, we'll focus here on the Canadian Rail Operating Rules because that's what we have. I guess the question I would have also would be, when did the Canadian Rail Operating Rules, General Rule number 10 on familiarization, go into effect? I have the 2013 version here. Was this rule there in 2007? When CN was clearly violating it if they weren't making sure that their employees were familiar with the yard and that type of stuff. So, if you're not providing maps and they have to make their own sketches, you're really not ensuring yard familiarization, especially not for a yard this big. Just my humble opinion. Again, you're free to form your own. I've been dealing with this stuff for years now, so nothing surprises me anymore when it comes to rail carriers, the corrupt government of Canada, Transport Canada, the Transportation Safety Board, or the Occupational Health and Safety Tribunal of Canada. And I would add to that lack of, I would call, proper investigations by the Minister of Justice, the RCMP, etc. Because to this day, haven't seen it. All right, what you have here on the left is taken from the Canada Gazette, and this came out in December of 2024, as the Government of Canada is now rushing to try to rewrite the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation. That is SOR 87-150, having to do with frontline training programs. And that does not include the previous regulation, which has been in place for 38 years now, did not have a specific program for belt pack or remote control locomotive operators or for rail traffic controllers, and I would add also not for track maintenance workers. They still don't want to add that one, and I think everybody needs to push back on that. Frontline track workers are begging to be included in this regulation that's being rewritten, and doesn't appear that Minister Chrystia Freeland wants to include them. Well, we're not in the 1800s. Technology has changed a lot as far as what track workers do. And, hot boxes, whatever, the electronics involved, the signal maintenance, all of that. They need to be included. If they want to be included in this regulation, they should be included. And if they're not, and people keep dying on the tracks as maintenance workers, in my opinion, class action. And I would gladly help you with documentation showing how much Transport Canada has failed to do its oversight job for, quite frankly, decades, in my humble opinion. But anyway, that's another issue. But this is taken from the Canada Gazette, and if you look here, it's showing that this has to do with training requirements for REQSR, stands for Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation. That's the current regulation versus the proposed regulation. And if you look here under familiarization training, it says that it's not applicable under the current regulation, but it is part of the Canadian Railway Operating Rules. They're just not enforceable in court, right? So I guess all those other rules they talk about in railway investigation reports, all those other rules that are violated by frontline rail workers, those aren't enforceable in court either. So let's not even discuss them. Nobody should be getting fired over those, right? Is that the attitude of the Government of Canada and Transport Canada? That's kind of a fine line to be walking on, in my humble opinion. But anyway, so if you look at the proposed regulation, they're showing that that would be a new thing, to have familiarization training. Well, Minister of Transportation Freeland, it just took the Government of Canada 38 years to propose this as a new legal requirement in regulations. which are enforceable in court. Hooray for you! Thumbs up! It only took the government 38 years to see the importance of this. But, like I said, courtrooms can also decide what is or is not criminal negligence, right? So anyways, general rule, Canadian rail operating rules, according to the Government of Canada's own websites, rules are not generally enforceable in court. Remember that, all you rail workers out there, when you're told you're violating a Canadian rail operating rule. I guess you could say, sue me. You could not lose your job over something that's not enforceable in court if you can show that the rail carriers are disregarding these rules. Well, why should you be having to follow them if the rail carriers themselves ignore them, right? Anyway, that's the whole issue, folks. Real beauty for a legal team, that's for sure. But I have a feeling as more and more of these issues come to light for frontline rail families, for rail investors especially, I personally, even as an MA in finance, I got to tell you, if you told me that CN was providing no maps for big rail yards like Mac Yard and that, you guys can just draw your own little sketches, and in the Railway Investigation Report, R07T0270, tied to the Mac Yard incident, you can go look exactly at the sketch that apparently rail workers were making. There's one provided in that report. It's pretty pitiful compared to, what should have been provided, which shows the entrance to Mac Yard by CN Rail. But you should go compare those two things. Go look at that little hand-drawn sketch done by a frontline rail worker trying to give himself something to become more familiar with the territory in which he operated. It's pretty freaking pathetic, in my humble opinion. As we go through these materials, before I keep going on the Mac Yard incident itself, you should be asking yourself right now, as I say, these rail executives brought their operational excellence over to the U.S. Who were the rail executives that might have been involved? Well, I don't know if John Orr was still there when the Mac Yard incident actually happened. When it comes to John Orr, he became the Chief Operations Officer at Norfolk Southern March 20th, 2024. Prior to that, he worked at CPKC and KCS and CN Rail in various roles. He has spent decades in the rail industry. What I do know of John Orr is that he became general manager. He was the assistant general manager of Mac Yard in 2005. In 2006, he was promoted to general manager. Now, this bio only says that he went to Edmonton, to the Prairie Subdivision in 2007. But I could not find an exact date. Was that before August 14th of 2007 when this conductor was fake qualified in Mac Yard? I have no way of knowing. I'm just raising the issue that John Orr, who is now Chief Operations Officer at Norfolk Southern, especially given the potential merger now for Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern, John Orr was definitely at Mac Yard in 2005 and 2006. When was fake qualifications happening? I don't know when he left Mac Yard in 2007. That would be the question, and it's a critical question. He may be completely innocent when it comes to fake qualifications. I'm just saying, I know for a fact he was there in 2005 and 6. In 2007, he went to Edmonton. I do not know the exact date. The only reason I raise that is because of the Union Pacific Norfolk Southern merger and the fact that John Orr did come from CN Rail. So just an issue to have behind the scenes. I don't know. So if it wasn't John Orr that was there when the fake qualifications were definitely happening in Mackyard, who was there and who was in charge? Who was the person who was overseeing Mackyard in 2007? And did that person oversee Mackyard for all of 2007? That's the question. I have no way of knowing. Okay, so the one person that I do know for a fact was in charge of Mackyard, not as general manager, but as chief operations manager or operations officer. So the top operations role at CN Rail was held by Keith Creel. He was chief operations officer at CN Rail from May 2007 until January 2013. So that time frame definitely includes the time for the Mackyard incident of 2007, including when that employee was fake qualified. That employee was fake qualified on August 14th, 2007. And so that's right at the time that Keith Creel took over overseeing operations. Keith Creel became president and CEO of CPKC in April 2023. So when I say these rail executives were allowed to escape to the U.S., fake qualifications and the using of outdated training materials, all those issues that I raised basically in matters pertaining to the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney. Now, Keith Creel left in January of 2013, but the operational excellence that was going on from 2007 to 2000 and early 2013, that would have been under Keith Creel. After that, Jim Vena took over, and Jim Vena is now Union Pacific CEO. And in my opinion, there is no way that Jim Vena did not know CN was violating laws when conductor trainee Jason Clooney was killed, and I'm of the definite opinion that that man was part of the death cover-up. I do not believe he did not realize CN was violating a lot of laws when that young man was killed. But that was under Jim Vena. Keith Creel, he became the CPC Chief Operations Officer in February of 2013. Prior to that, he had held various roles at CN Rail. But if you look at this one on... this I took from the CN Fact Book on Keith Creel. It says that he was appointed Executive Vice President of Operations in May of 2007, and he was responsible for the company's rail operations in both Canada and the United States since 2007. And so if there's any accidents or bad stuff that was happening at CP Rail in the U.S., that would have been also under Keith Creel. And I've got a lot of issues with Keith Creel. But anyway, also, not the least of which is, the CP derailment in Field, BC, and the fact that one of the CP police investigators basically in a newscast with Dave Seglins of the CBC, I think it appeared on Fifth Estate, which is kind of like a 60 Minutes in Canada. But Dave Seglins, when he interviewed one of the CP police officers, the CP police officer stated he was suspecting a cover-up at CP Rail in matters pertaining to that February 4th, 2019 derailment, when that would have been when Keith Creel was CEO at CP Rail, and 3 frontline rail workers died in that horrific derailment in Field, BC. So, do I think Keith Creel has skeletons? In my opinion, absolutely. But, you know, if you're Chief Operations Officer for CN Rail, should you not know that you're fake qualifying frontline rail workers? And don't forget, he would have been there as Chief Operations Officer during the attempted rewrite of the regulation, the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation, which in my opinion, that rewrite was a total public scam, and we'll get into that in other videos. But Keith Creel would have been Chief Operations Officer at CN Rail when that first attempt to rewrite that regulation happened after the Mackyard incident of 2007, when it was clear that there were fake qualifications going on at CN Rail. And in my opinion, they continued. My child was fake qualified in 2013. Yes, it was after Keith Creel had left, but did he leave his operational excellence behind when he left? The training materials were clearly out of date, and test questions were out of date. So, you know, if somebody in Mackyard could be qualified with potentially only 37% of the training they should have had maybe for that yard, or less than 50% for sure, if it was, you know, only 22 of 45 required trial trips, you know, Keith Creel, that would have been under your watch. Don't know how else to say it, but it would have been under your watch, and you were definitely part of those who would have been in the overhaul of all training programs for frontline rail workers, that very failed attempt, which happened 18 years ago. And it was never made into law. What was done was never made into law. That would have gone through the Railway Association of Canada. But again, the two major carriers would have been CN and CP Rail in Canada. There's Via Rail, which is passenger, but the fake qualifications. Via Rail, I don't believe, has its own training centers for frontline rail workers. I do believe they hire from either CN or CP Rail. And so training programs tied to frontline rail workers, those would have been at CN or CP. And it would have been CN and CP primarily working with the Railway Association of Canada to overhaul these frontline training programs. Yes, there are 50 to 60 members in the Railway Association of Canada, but the two biggest players were definitely CN and CP Rail. So when I say that, you know, rail executives were allowed to escape to the U.S., in my humble opinion, that includes Keith Creel. As we consider the implications of all of this, and you need to look at it and say, okay, what were all the changes that were implemented to frontline training programs at CN Rail? Whether or not that was, you know, prior to the Mackyard incident or after Keith Creel left. When did those changes happen? When did all changes happen to frontline rail worker training programs? And which ones were violations of the Railway Safety Act? Because again, the Railway Safety Act sections 20 It starts actually discussing this at sections 18, 19, and 20. 18 and 19 talk about changes to training programs that are initiated via a Railway Safety Act Section 19 order, which is what was issued after the Mackyard incident. That is when the Ministry of Transportation issues a need to change training programs. Section 20 has to do with changes that are initiated by the rail carriers themselves, and they have to go through the same type of procedure. The changes have to first be filed with Transport Canada for the review of the Minister of Transportation and for approval prior to field implementation. And so when you're considering all these changes that happened at Mackyard, so that now people could be qualified, within 12 weeks basically, that the observation trips were being counted along with the trial trips. Who implemented that? Was that implemented under Keith Creel? If the person could be qualified in 12 weeks, and Keith Creel was made Chief Operations Officer in May, June, July, August would be 10 weeks. When did Keith Creel become Chief Operations Officer? When in May did he become Chief Operations Officer? And where were your compliance audits as a Chief Operations Officer over all those years to make sure that your employees were getting the training they were supposed to receive? And that would go all the way until 2013 when you left. And the same questions would be true for Jim Vena, because there were a whole series of changes to training programs which were identified upon the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney. Well, which ones of those were implemented by Jim Vena when he became Chief Operations Officer after Keith Creel left CN Rail, and which ones were implemented by Keith Creel prior to his leaving? These are all very serious issues. Who did what? Who did what changes at CN Rail when it comes to frontline training programs? And did they go through the proper procedures? My bet would be they did not. I asked for all of the proof of programs having gone through Transport Canada for prior approval. I was given nothing by Transport Canada. That does not look good for CN Rail and its operations officers, who have now both escaped to the U.S. Keith Creel is the CEO at CPKC. Jim Vena is CEO at Union Pacific. And if Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern merge, right now plans are for Jim Vena to become the CEO of the new merged company. And folks, in my opinion, that simply cannot be allowed. And U.S. rail carriers need to implement compliance audits, as do U.S. rail regulators and rail unions. And rail investors should insist upon seeing those audits to make sure frontline rail workers are getting the training they're supposed to get. Otherwise, if I was a rail investor, I'd be running from all of these companies, quite frankly. Just my humble opinion. So this is going to end part 2 of the Mackyard incident and fake qualifications at CN Rail. We're going to keep looking at this incident and its critical implications for all frontline rail workers, rail investors, rail customers. And by that, I do absolutely mean in both Canada and the US. So have a great day, and I will see you on part 3.